Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lillian and I'll be moderating the webinar today. Today's topic is on enterprise agreements and collective bargaining and is brought to you by Australian Business Lawyers and Advisors. Presenting today is ABLA CEO and Director Nigel Ward and Senior Associate Michael Rochak. Just before we begin, I'd like to remind you this webinar is interactive and we do encourage you to submit any questions you have via the chat box on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. There's a small grey cog icon where you can enter your messages on the right of it in the grey box. We will aim to answer as many questions as possible throughout the presentation, and if we do run out of time, we'll try to respond to you privately. Just so you're aware, this is a private chat, so you'll only see the questions and answers that you submit. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Nigel.
Well, Mike, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Nigel.
I see we've already up to about 15 questions before we've even opened up the microphone, so we're going to do our best today.
We will.
We've got about an hour. Look, you'll have to bear with us a bit. We had a bit of a juggle before we decided to do today's topic about exactly what we'd cover. We're not going to talk about the entire legal bargaining process. We're going to touch on the cultural piece, but we just don't have time to go into it in great detail. I want to stick to some key insights, I think is probably the best thing to do today, Mike, and that's what we're going to try and travel through. I'll take the lead, and Mike's going to be my co-pilot for today, which is great.
Excellent.
I think the best place to start is at the beginning. Just bear with me, everybody. I'm just struggling to get the slide pack to turn. Here we go. People don't often ask the question, well, why am I going to do this? There'll be a lot of people on the line who are contemplating bargaining for the first time, and I think it's a very important question to pose, and we'll explain why in a little while. After 30 years of doing this, Mike's done a little less, he's slightly younger than I am. After 30 years of doing this, it sort of comes down to these. The obvious one is you need to legalise something. That is, I'm covered by a modern award, it's just not quite working for me.
Yes.
I suspect, Mike, in your experience, that's probably the most common.
It is that I have one award or many awards, and I'm trying to simplify things a little bit administratively.
Yeah. Union compulsion, obviously, is a big one. Whether or not that's just the union's part of our life and it's what we do, or in the case of some people, the union's encroached into our world and they're now forcing us through the legal process to bargain.
Yes.
A lot of people got into bargaining in the early 90s. It was a little easier to get out of it back then, and they're now stuck in it culturally. The next one is locking in directly. This is an interesting one. We have a lot of people come to us sometimes and say, look, culture's really good, starting to get big, unions starting to play a role in our lives, but we kind of want to lock everything in now before we get too big. And so we tend to deal with a lot of people who are doing what we call locking in.
Yes.
Some people just have to have their rights settled. You get people come to us sometimes and say, look, I'm signing a contract for a project. They've told me I can't have an industrial action for the 3 years of the project. Good example of that would be?
Well, we had contact with a chamber member recently in relation to some civil engineering work that you know, they commonly undertake. They are an interesting workforce in that they had, 20 employees at the time of the last bargaining process. They have about 60 now, and they want a way of operating into the future, locked in, so that they can operate with certainty, with finality in relation to the project and that they want to undertake in the future.
Construction would be the classic example of that. Sometimes contract cleaning projects, you have to have an enterprise agreement.
Yes.
That's locked your terms in for the term of the contract.
That's right.
And the last one, and look, probably not for the smaller people who are listening in terms of the scale of their business, the bigger people, sometimes we just get people come to us and say, look, massive portfolio business, 10 modern awards, want to create a common employment platform, a common sense of offering, and sometimes the enterprise agreement's a good device for that.
That's right.
Now, you've got to understand that that's why you're doing it.
But just before, Nigel, before we get into that, we've got a couple of questions here which I think really feed well into the topics that we're discussing right now. In terms of Well, really, can an EA increase productivity in my organisation? I mean, it's quite a broad question, quite an open question, but it is a very interesting question and one that I think we should interrogate a little bit.
Okay, let me have it's a good question to start with, actually. I saw you creeping to that question pretty quickly. I'm going to give a poor answer and say it depends, but I'll explain what I mean by that. Look, the answer is yes, if the thing that's holding your productivity back is a structural problem, say in a modern ward. Good example of that would be, look, the span of hours in the modern ward are actually preventing me or hindering me actually structuring my business in a productive way. The modern ward isn't allowing me to engage labour in a productive way. So if you're changing something structural, I'm going to say yes. If your real issues in your business, though, are leadership-based, cultural-based, the answer is probably going to be no. So I think people need to think a little bit harder about whether or not what's the thing they're really trying to change, what's the real driver that's going to create the productive outcome they want. More often than not, we see the prohibition against improving productivity being more about leadership and culture than it actually is what's in the modern award today.
And that leadership and engagement question really leads on to another great question, that is, will an EA necessarily increase my employee engagement? Now, of course, again, it depends on a range of factors, and it may depend on whether leadership is engaging employees themselves. But an EA conducted in collaboration with, the employees, it can definitely increase employee engagement. It can make employees buy into the project, into the life of the organisation, and into the objectives that the organisation is seeking to achieve.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but two things I'll probably add to that. Yes, you're right, it can. If your process is inconsistent with the way you manage and your culture, it can actually have disastrous effects in terms of employee engagement. There's issues about third parties becoming involved in your business and how they impact engagement. I'm going to talk a little bit later on about what we call the negative bargaining cycle. We'll also touch on what I call the big six. That is, what do you do in between bargaining rounds? Most people go to sleep, and that's the real danger. But look, yes, it can, but you want to be careful thinking it's the magic panacea to improving employee engagement. And they're good questions, Mike. I'm pleased you pulled us up. That was good. Look, some absolutely appalling reasons to start bargaining, without a doubt. And frankly, I saw the first one last year. The HR manager wants to do it because they want it on their CV.
And that's a classic one. That is purely self-interest, not about the company's objectives, not about where the company should go, not about whether there's been any thought into whether we're entering a regulated environment for the right reasons. Yeah. It's purely and simply a careerist issue.
I know that none of the people listening today would fall into that category, but bizarrely, yeah, I've often had HR managers say, look, I haven't done this and I need to get it on my CV. Very bad reason. It'll make payroll's life easier. That's an appalling reason to do it as well. And Mike did actually use the word administrative convenience earlier, and I'll teach him he shouldn't do that next time. But if it's purely about administration, then you want to think long and hard, because as Mike just said, you're moving into a regulated world, and once you get in it, it's a world that's hard to get out. So we might just touch on that. Why is it important to understand why you're doing it, and for doing it for the right reasons? Number one, if you haven't bargained before, and you've got good leadership model, you've got good engaged culture, most of your people probably think about their relationships at work on an individual basis, and the obvious example of that is my immediate manager. Yeah. If you're going to start bargaining, people will start to think a little bit more about their relationships collectively, and that can have major challenges for your culture. So that's number one. I think Michael touched on this when he talked about moving into the regulated environment. Once you start, it's legally very, very hard to stop. Mike, in work choices world, you could get out. In Fair Work world, it's very, very hard to get out. You can apply to terminate enterprise agreements, but on very limited basis.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And you just need to be going into the bargaining world with your eyes wide open about what it is. And it may be that you've always bargained and that you'd be better off stopping. But if you're considering bargaining for the first time on the basis of that administrative convenience, then that may not be what's right for you. If you've got 4 awards or 5 awards in your organisation, it may be one of a range of factors that you might consider, but it's not, oh, I want to do this because it's mostly the simple way out.
The third one I think is critical, that the minute you put something in an enterprise agreement, it's very hard to change it, believe it or not. 2 things I've experienced over the years. One is the minute you want to change something, employees read the agreement for the first time and realise everything else that's in it.
Yeah.
And probably the second one, which is very important as well, is the minute you say we need to change something, there is always an air of suspicion and anxiety.
Yeah.
So once in, difficult to get out.
That's right.
And look, lastly but not leastly, just be conscious that because of the actual way the bargaining process operates, more often than not, it is a key union activity for increasing membership. So not only do you have the issue of unions being default bargaining representatives, talk about that a little later, but the truth is that most unions will see bargaining time as membership recruitment time as well.
Yep.
And you've got to bear that in mind.
And that can certainly hamstring how long it takes to get an agreement over the line. We'll get onto that also in a moment. It can lead to your messages being delivered to your employees in a slightly different way or a completely different way, depending on how much of an assistance that is for union organisers and advocates and others to engage their bases to say, the boss has it in for you, the boss doesn't want to give you that, the boss is well off and you guys are not well off. And again, we'll also get onto that in a moment. So if you are deciding to get into this environment, it's really important to look at those sorts of factors, and also, which we'll get onto shortly on the next slide, that you lose the ability to be agile in decision making and to change, on the run when you need to pivot and do something in a slightly different way. All of a sudden there are consultation obligations. All of a sudden you have to sometimes bargain for those changes, and you can't do that until the next round. Yeah, look,
it's interesting. The 1, 2, 3, industrialising the employment relationship. I'd love to claim that I actually created this 1, 2, 3. I didn't. I'll pay my dues. An excellent practitioner called Damien Sloan, who works for Toll Holdings, top bloke as well. Damien came up with this late one night, and I've stolen it ever since, so I'll pay my dues to Damien. Golden rule, if you're going to bargain, money before agility to change. That is, give money away before you give away agility to change your business.
And that's a really, really, really important point. If you want to increase it by your wages by a certain amount, 1%, 2%, 3% per year or more, then that is something that employees listen to much more than a change in the way something occurs in their workplace. And so, of course, that's your primary lever. You don't want to start increasing by too much, because then that becomes the default position. So there's a bit of a tension there from round to round in terms of bargaining.
Number 2 is if you've got to give agility away, give agility away before your right to manage. And rule number 3 is never give away your right to manage. If you do, it's going to take you a long time to get it back. And what does that mean practically? Look, we get frustrated when we see people trying to write policies into enterprise agreements. We get frustrated when we see people trying to write work health and safety rules into enterprise agreements, discrimination rules. And the worst one I've ever seen was we had a 6-page clause which dealt with the right of employees to appeal management's decisions to promote people. These are all areas where the enterprise agreement is going to diminish your right to manage, diminish your right to be agile. If you are bargaining, give money away before you give away agility, and give money away before you give away your right to bargain. And look, more often than not, if I'm doing a workshop with people, it never ceases to amaze me how many times we'll find this out. A lot of people will come to us, we'll do a triage on what's causing them the problem today. More often than not, this is, I've got an enterprise agreement and I'm examining what's going wrong with it. And what we actually find is the problem's not in the agreement at all.
That's right.
Problems in how we run the business ourselves, the problems in how we're actually making management decisions. So money before agility, agility before right to manage, but also please, please, please make sure you understand whether or not the problem's actually in your enterprise agreement before you try and change it, or whether or not it's in the way you're running the business. So, some key insights really as you go into it, and some sort of major ideas to have in your head.
Yeah.
I want to just talk about bargaining environment. Now, I could have spent 4 hours on this, and Mike's very aware of that. Got a question, Mike?
We do. We've got a question. We have a collaborative workforce, but we want to obtain specific objectives from bargaining. How does management get what it wants whilst not dampening that collaborative spirit of cooperation?
I'm gonna thank the person who sent that in. That is, I couldn't have worded that better myself. Great question. And I might try and deal with it in this context if I can. There's probably 5 bargaining environments you can live in. I tended to concentrate on 4. The worst one's pattern bargaining for people who are in the construction industry. They would know that you don't really bargain very much at all. Very strong union control in that industry, particularly in Melbourne and Victoria. Culture is probably at best compliant in most businesses.
Yep.
And it's basically sign here. So let's just put that to one side for a minute. Most people are going to find themselves contemplating whether or not they're going to bargain transactionally or on a relational basis. And this comes to the question. A lot of people think that bargaining is about an event every 2 or 3 years. It's about how do I get more out of it than my employees or the union.
This is our showdown.
Our showdown. As you would know, Mike, they serve us with a ambit log of claims. We serve them with one back. This is an entirely opportunistic way to bargain. If you want to do it, be warned that most people who bargain this way ultimately will have erosion in their culture. They'll have erosion in the trust of management, because management are seen to be entirely opportunistic and transactional. And
it's really, you'll find that you will present your log of claims to the union, your response to their log of claims. You will find that the messages you've been telling to your employees have been repackaged and resold to present the management in the worst possible light to the employees, and then there's a complete breakdown in trust. And that's where transactional bargaining, I think, there's the nub of the issue there. That you will find that over the course of one set of
3 cycles,
exactly, you will find that you will lose significant trust, and you may start getting issues around staff turnover, reputational issues, people not wanting to join your organisation.
Absolutely spot on. Now look, sometimes you have to accept that you're in a transactional bargain environment and you've got to play it as carefully as you can. I'm a massive proponent of what I call relational bargaining. That is a very honest conversation straight up, that you're not going to play the ambit game, that the relationship's more important than anything else, and the relationship has to be as good when you come out, which really goes to our listener's question. On this occasion, it's about having a conversation about what the business needs to go forward and what the employees need, and understanding that you've dealt with your needs and their needs at the same time.
Yep.
If you go in with that mindset, then you've got a very different approach in terms of trying to ensure that what you're asking for is what I call culturally acceptable. And if you go in with that mindset, then there's a very strong chance that you will maintain that collaborative spirit, that spirit of cooperation you've got in the workforce. If you go in on a hard transactional basis, you're going to blow it out of the water. Now, look, I threw process-driven up there. You tend to have a very engaged culture, reasonably low union involvement to move into a process-driven environment. An example of that would be, we've dealt with a number of people over the years who've said, look, we've really matured. We get that we're going to have an enterprise agreement, can't legally get rid of it. What can we do? Because we just don't want to keep circling back and arguing about this or that. And we've seen a lot of people, for instance, link wage outcomes to staff wage outcomes. That would be a good example of process-driven. So we're all in it together. If our staff are getting 2.8% this year, our wages employees are going to get the same amount of money. So as your culture evolves, you can think about bargaining in a slightly different way. But my focus here would be, say, relational bargaining is the key to maintaining good culture, not necessarily what you do to change your culture.
Nigel, I think the $64 million question here is, how do you get from your transactional bargaining relationship to that more mature, we're part of an industry, the industry is growing in a different way, or we've got headwinds or challenges, or we've got a local pressure in terms of our region, jobs are evaporating, we want to bargain with you within a framework where we fully understand everybody's position, and it more moves towards relational or process driven.
I knew you were going to ask the hard question. No, you were going to ask the hard question. Look, the first way of answering that is to say sometimes it's going to take 3 or 4 cycles.
Yes.
But please don't think it takes one. We're dealing with somebody right now, and I've said to them very honestly, it's 3 cycles, okay? So you're probably going to see me for the next 6 to 9 years. It's got to be a 3-cycle program. The next thing is you've got to consider very carefully what you're going to do when you're not bargaining, which we'll come on to. That's the big 6.
Yep.
And you've got to slowly start to seed consistent messages in the approach you adopt to bargaining. And there may well be a need, to put it bluntly, to turn the other cheek for a while and show people that you're not going to be dragged back into the gutter of transactional bargaining. So the first 1 or 2 cycles can be quite hard, because I'm saying take a high ground approach to this, and they're trying to drag you back down. And quite often you get managers say, look, yeah, I get this, Nigel, I understand strategically what we're doing, but let me get back in the gutter and just take a swipe for once, and then we'll climb back up again. So look, it's not an easy journey, and it's probably one that's company specific.
Yep. And
it's one you'd have to map out. We might just in answering that, Mike, we might just jump ahead a slide. I keep saying the big 6. The important thing if you want to improve that bargaining process is, what do you do when you're not bargaining? We get a lot of people sort of go through the bargaining process, wipe their brow and go, oh, that's great, we'll see you in 3 more years. It's not the way to do it. So in the off season, you're a footballer, you get off season.
That's right.
In the off season, you should be doing the big 6.
Yeah.
Are you evolving inclusive values-based leadership? Is that part of how you're running your HR and your leadership model?
That's right.
Effective direct supervision. Please, I always say to companies, if you've only got $1 of development money to spend for your staff, could I spend it on your shift supervisors rather than your executive team, because you get more bang for your buck.
Yep.
And your direct supervisors have got to improve their style. They've got to have a very clear, consistent framework for managing people. Open and direct communication. Make sure it's not filtered through union delegates is a classic case. Am I actually developing my people who, my voters? Are they being developed? Effective internal welfare issues. You would know very well that, particularly dealing with larger businesses or even very small businesses, if the staff have a problem and they think you are going to fairly and reasonably solve it for you, there's a strong chance then that they'll create trust and confidence, and there's less need for a third party in the world. So effective internal welfare is very important.
And when you've effectively dealt with those issues and you have built up that trust, then when you get to bargaining, and you may have a very oppositional, very sort of transactional union that bargaining representative that becomes involved, and they try to sell messages to employees that employees know very well better, that in fact, no, management has listened to us on this, and they actually build distrust in their union representatives.
Yeah, that's true, and more often than not, we've actually seen situations where employees almost are a little apologetic about what's going on. Those would be great signs that you're moving out of the transactional world. Yes. And look, the last one I've got here is sound performance management, and I think we spent an hour last time talking about this, the good and the bad. So please praise the good and manage performance that's not so the big 6 is what you do in the meantime to try and move yourself into a better bargaining environment. And I think, as we said before, look, if you fail, you get into this thing called the...
How bad can it get?
Yeah, good question. Pretty bad, mate. Pretty bad. I modelled this when I was a lot younger. I actually did a study at a large quarry of a company I'd worked with very closely over a number of years that wasn't going very, very well. Their world was very simple. Before bargaining commenced, about 6 months, the employees would come up with things in the thought they'd have to give something away. So they'd kind of withdraw from being cooperative to come up with things to give away. You'd then bargain. That was normally quite torrid, heavy union involvement. You'd then spend the next year kind of patching things up, and you never quite got back. And I'll be honest, in the case I'm thinking about in my head, within 10 years, which is kind of like 2, 3, 4 cycles for them, they had gone from a reasonably constructive work environment to something that these days most people would probably call a war zone, which is most people came to work saying, well, you know, how are we going to mess you up today? So look, it can get bad if you're not getting on top of it and you're not managing it properly. But I'm pleased to say they sat down and fixed themselves up in the end, but it took them about 7 or 8 years to get out of their hole.
And I think this slide here really shows the sort of slow degradation that happens over the course of bargaining periods if you don't approach things well, implement the big 6 when you're not bargaining, and you take, you know, a very sort of transactional approach to it. You can see that when you enter the bargaining period, it can deteriorate quite quickly, where you can kind of hit rock bottom, where you're talking about, no, we won't live with this, we won't be able to operate in this way, this will kill us. The employees are threatening strike action. Then you actually come together, you've voted up an agreement. People have seen that perhaps even if they didn't vote yes on the agreement, the sky didn't fall in. But when you get back up to that stabilisation phase, you've actually dropped off, and you haven't gotten back to that equilibrium. You've actually, and if that happens again over a number of cycles, you're going down. So it is very, very vital. And I think there's a good question here, which has come from a listener. We got what we wanted from bargaining, but in order to get there, we effectively divided our employees into several camps. Now they are split, and they don't want to work cooperatively. What do we do? And I think we've gone there with the big 6, but I think it's important to maybe reiterate that perhaps that is the worst of the transactional approach.
Well, be careful, because no, they might have had a very clear strategy here. We'll be careful with that. Let's not suggest we know what the listener was actually doing. My immediate reaction, Michael, a tad self-serving, is give me a call and we'll see what we can do for you. I think the question here, though, might be a bit different, and this is, it might well be that this was a very specific strategy to try and win a vote, and they knew that they could win the vote by attracting to one part of their workforce, the majority, but in doing that they disenfranchised another part of their workforce, the minority. So it's possible that it might have actually been an intended strategy. Must confess, I've done that a couple of times to try and make major change in an enterprise agreement. A lot will depend on whether or not that is the case, or whether or not it's just people became disaffected in the process. I would urge you to go back and start thinking about whether or not you've got a sort of big 6 journey over the next couple of years, and you can actually start to re-engage. Or if it was the case you've played one off against the other, I'll be really candid, that could be a 5+ year journey. You've just got to be honest about the fact that you've really burnt part of your workforce to achieve your outcome. That might not be a great answer, but we'd probably have to look at the circumstances a little bit more specifically about what we've got. Now, as always, Lillian's hurrying me up a little bit, but that's okay.
I think we're right on schedule. I think we're fine.
Let's talk about comms and voting. Yep. Boy, we could take a very long time talking about communication. Let me just start with the first one, long lead. What do I mean by that? And I'm not sure if I'm going to be mischievous and jump ahead. This is my favourite bargaining moment, right? You go and see a company and they go, it's time to start again. Their immediate reaction is to tell the employees they're poor, but it's okay, we love you. And I apologise if that sounds slightly facetious, but if I had $1 for every time I did that, I'd be retired somewhere living in. But if I had $1 for every time I did that, I'd be retired somewhere living in Greece probably by now. But it's amazing how often that signal gets sent about 3 or 4 months before the bargaining starts. So let's just drop back a minute. Long lead communication. If you really do need to have a difficult conversation with your people in the context of bargaining, then you want to start asking yourself about that the day after you finished your last agreement. So if it's economic headwinds, in a lot of trouble, by the time you sit down around the table, the employee should have been communicated in a way that that's a given. So sometimes we get people come to us and say, look, I need to change 80% of this document, which is, by the way, it's a very big ask. And my first comment is, well, when do you start bargaining? They say in 3 weeks' time. Guess what? That's going to be a transactional nightmare at best. But if they come to us and say in 3 years' time, then we can say, right, okay, what's the long lead communication? So the first question about comms is, do you need long lead communication?
Yeah.
Probably not as big an issue these days, but do your people need to be educated a little bit about the process? One of the classic questions we always get asked is, even if I don't have a bargaining rep, does the employee get to vote? Little things like that can actually create disquiet amongst employees.
Absolutely.
So sometimes a little bit of education goes a long way.
And it also assists employees if they get the right information from their manager or their line manager or their supervisor, and they've been keyed up effectively by the management, senior management team. There's a trust relationship there.
Yeah.
And the messages that you feed down through those channels are well received.
Absolutely. Now look, that kind of leads us on to key messages. Whenever I'm working with a company, the first thing I will say to them when we talk about communication is, I want 4, 5, 6 tops key messages. They're dot points. It's the elevator speech. When are we going to use these? Well, every one of your key managers who's involved is going to know these. When somebody grabs them in the corridor and they get stuck, they can use them. When we write anything to the employees, we're going to make sure that we reflect one or more of these every time we write. So we've got a consistent narrative. There is absolutely nothing worse than sitting down with a company, planning a really good bargaining process, and then you find that half a dozen managers don't truly know what we're doing and how we're doing it. And so they say something completely, bad to the employees when asked, and all of a sudden we're sort of running around chicken with our head cut off. So key messages are critical. The other thing I would say is I'm a big believer in communicating during the process. So after every bargaining meeting, I will always want the company to communicate in a fashion that's appropriate to it. If it's a true blue-collar environment, it's a blue piece of paper with 4 dot points on it. If it's a white-collar environment, it might be a little more than that. Average reading age in Australia is still, I think, year 8.
Right.
So don't write lots. But what's that communication going to have in it? It's going to have the company's position. Never try and tell people what the other side's position is, particularly if it's a union. One, because you then get into a scrap about whether or not you've quoted them properly. But that's a matter for them. What you should be making sure is the employees know your position.
And it's really, as you say, really important to do this on a regular basis so that you don't get that horror toolbox meeting with 100 employees all shouting and putting their hand up and vehemently disagreeing with company positions, where the distrust is built over a month or 6 weeks or 8 weeks. And this toolbox meeting, updating them, really is more of a clearing the air, putting out fires discussion rather than an effective communication meeting.
Yeah, mate, that's spot on, because you're right. If you leave a vacuum, somebody's going to fill it. And look, if it's a really warm, loving relationship process, you might be more relaxed about that. If there's a little bit of a contest, third-party involvement, you leave a vacuum, somebody's going to fill it. And it might not be mischievously filled. It might just be filled with people's views that are just quite wrong.
Yes.
So you've got to try and do that. That jumps us kind of nicely forward to the vote. I could spend several hours talking about the vote. Just remember one thing: at the end of the day, bargaining is ultimately about, can I win a vote? The question I'll always ask you if you're involved with us is, are we at a point where we can win a vote?
Yes.
And if you go yes, I'll challenge you as to why you hold that view. The next question is, okay, well, if you think we can win a vote, how do we close the process down so that we can actually get a vote and move forward? So just never lose sight of the fact that it's really about how do I win a vote, and there's not a lot of reasons why people vote. Not a lot of reasons at all. Sometimes the outcome is culturally accepted as given. That's if you've got a really good progressive culture. Sometimes you have to buy the vote. I don't mean that facetiously, but every now and again you'll be in a room saying, you know, if we put a little bit of sugar on the table, we might get this one up. That's just the truth. Sadly, given the way our bargaining system works, sometimes you force the outcome. Sometimes that is through industrial action of some form, that is withstanding it and not giving in, perhaps more than, say, employers locking out. I might make a comment about lockouts.
Yeah.
But also, I think sometimes force is just not just economic pressure. It might just be, look, people get that we have to make this change, otherwise we've got some problems in the business.
Sometimes employees get bargaining fatigue and they are sick of hearing all the messages, though they may be very good messages from employers or their union reps. They just want to keep working, and they want to come to work, finish their shift, go home, put food on the table, and then get back to the general day-to-day life. They're kind of sick of the constant updates from each party, and sometimes employees are happy if they've got X number of % of their wage increase. They're happy to just bring it forward and have it done. And you can pick up those messages, can't you?
You can very, very quickly. You're absolutely right. We'll talk a little about fatigue later on before we close. I can't leave the notion of lockouts for a minute. Every now and again, I will have clients ring us up and say, "Oh, look, we went somewhere else." They've told us that the way we're going to achieve our goals is they put this strategy together, and if we get down to this part, we're going to lock everybody out. I'm going to beg and beseech you. If you seriously lock people out, you can be talking about a 10-year cultural journey to get back. I've only been involved in 2 lockouts in my career. I understood why we did it. I actually spoke very passionately about not doing it actually, but the client went ahead. In both of those cases, it was a 10-year road back. And if you think a 10-year road back's easy, then you're kidding yourself. So those sorts of tactics are tactics of abject last resort. So please just be very careful if you're told that's a good idea.
Because if you've got employees who'd rather just get on with it and there's no work available for them because they cannot attend work and they will not get paid, then you've got issues. And you're going to disenfranchise not just people who have probably got the loudest voices in the room, but those quiet ones who are actually very happy to have voted or to agree with a proposition, but now find themselves in a position where, yeah, as I say, there's no work available and the boss has taken that step.
You're absolutely right. It tends to harden the views of the hardheads, and it tends to push everybody else towards the hardheads. And you've got to be, I mean, if you ever want to talk about lockouts, it's a long conversation, because you never lock anybody out unless you're prepared to lock them out indefinitely. You never lock them out for a short period. You've got to win that one, and you've got to be prepared for the cultural consequences of proceeding to win it. Losing it's unthinkable, actually.
Yep.
Look, believe it or not, how many agreements get voted up because of rational debate and reason? Sadly, not as many as we would like, but there's a few. Particularly if you are relationally bargaining, then you can have pretty good conversations about what the balance is and what the right balance is for the company and the employees. And let's not forget it, particularly if you're in an industrial environment, the truth is a lot of employees will turn around and look at the union official, and if the union official's nodding yes, then they're going to vote yes, and if the union official's nodding no, they're going to vote no. So just be very mindful of why the agreement might get voted up, and
that's probably also the relationship with the union representative, because it may be the same for the next 10, 15 years. And you don't want to burn bridges with that bargaining representative. You want to build a healthy relationship when it is the off season and we're not bargaining. That person comes to you with a concern on behalf of the membership that somebody's raised, or perhaps they've raised themselves. You don't want to trash that relationship in any way, and sometimes that's the simplest way to get an agreement up.
Oh, no, that's just in an industrial environment. Sometimes that's true. That you need that person on board, because that person at the end of the day controls the vote. And I would call that a true industrial negotiation versus perhaps bargaining in a general sense. Look, I put arbitration in there. The truth is that sort of 0.00% of agreements are actually arbitrated. Qantas obviously was the classic case, but there's only one Qantas in Australia, so please don't get too excited by that. The big question for me is always, well, what can you do to influence the vote? And you can do a lot. We tend to do a very detailed voter analysis with people when we're working with them. Sadly, I haven't got time to do that today. But there's a long list there of things you can do to try and motivate or influence people to vote for you as opposed to against you. And the big one on there for me is, do you actually know who the key influencers in your workplace are? Normally when I sit down with people for the first time, I'm going to say to them very early on, look, you've probably got 6 people. And when an issue arises, you know, they normally go and see Mike, or they go and see Abby. Okay, well, who are those people? And they normally do say to me, well, actually, that's Bob, Dennis, and Jane. Okay, fine. Well, how do we influence them? How do we engage with them? Because the odds are they're not just carrying their vote. They're carrying 8 votes or 10 votes or maybe even 20 votes, or in some cases it might be 50 or 60. So you've really got to work out what's your influence strategy for winning the vote, as much as you're interested in what goes into the agreement and what process you want to adopt. So a little bit about the bargaining path. I'm just going to get a time check from Lillian if I can. Just make sure we're travelling well. Oh, we're doing very well today. That's good. We were a little behind last time. Now, I once apologised for this. For the engineers who are listening in, this actually is how bargaining in Australia works. I don't want to take you through too much of this bargaining path at the moment. Obviously, there's a beginning to the path. We then find ourselves in the world of good faith bargaining. We then find ourselves in the world of making the agreement, voting the agreement, having it approved. And there's lots of nice little tangents along the way, such as industrial action and the like. I thought we might just focus on 2, given our time commitments today. And I picked 2 based on probably a conversation I had last week, which I thought might be out. The first one is bargaining reps. Now, there's a tactical piece here, but we'll just be fair for a minute. There is a legal piece. There's been a lot of debate, rancor, gnashing of teeth about the notice you have to send people to commence bargaining, the bargaining rights notice. But it's just changed, Mike, hasn't it?
It did. It changed on the 3rd of April, so approximately a week ago. And it changed as a result of the fact that the Notice of Employee Representational Rights, which must be issued at the commencement or 14 days after within 14 days after the commencement of bargaining, the notice is in a prescribed format. It's contained in the Fair Work Regulations. It could not and cannot be departed from, whether it was the form that it was previously in or the form that it is in now. But in a lot of instances, including some unfortunate instances involving clients or people we know, there have been...
Don't mention any names.
I won't. But needless to say that perhaps we weren't involved from the very, very, very beginning. But in terms of that notice, there had to be the correct phone number. And now sometimes people would put down the Fair Work Ombudsman's phone number. They would put down the Fair Work Commission info line, which of course is the correct number. But now from the 3rd of April, there is a new notice which does not require the employer to insert that number. And it doesn't sound like a lot. It sounds like sort of the overly pedantic piece of news to provide, but it is so crucially important. And it's crucially important because, of course, when it comes to filling out the F-17 to lodge the vote, to lodge the agreement to get passed after the vote, if that notice is incorrect, you must start again. And that is one of the most frustrating conversations to have with any business who perhaps have had a very long and drawn out bargaining process. They do not want that to occur, of course. So effectively what we now have is a notice which does not require that to occur, but still must be put out in the prescribed format, and we can assist obviously in any notice.
I think the key takeaways then are, after a lot of people getting small things on the notice wrong, which really weren't that important, and finding themselves in an invalid process, the notice has changed. So please, if you are about to start bargaining, please ring and make sure you get the right version, because if you use the old version, that will invalidate your process as well now. So that's the big takeaway. Question I get a lot, I might get you to answer it. Okay, so people are allowed to appoint themselves as bargaining reps. If I'm in the union is my default bargaining rep unless I appoint anybody else. How much can I encourage people to become bargaining reps in my workplace?
If you properly encourage people, you don't seek to exercise undue influence or undue control over those bargaining representatives, then that's entirely appropriate. But you must encourage them in the correct way, not in a way that's designed to sort of circumvent the democratic process of bargaining and approving a vote. If you know that person of influence within the organisation who may carry 20 votes might be an appropriate person who might be engaged in the bargaining process, who might have taken an interest in it last time, you may encourage them to take part and say, look, Bob or Jane, I really think you'd be a great person to come into the tent, to be involved. Obviously matter for you, but we thought we might make that proposal to you. That's entirely appropriate. If you tell them, if you tie it to some other benefit or some other instance of their employment, then obviously that's entirely inappropriate and frankly unlawful. So I wouldn't be proposing that. But it's all about not exercising undue influence or undue control over that person.
I never contemplated an inducement before. That's a good one, mate. So the bright lights are strapping you to the chair and persuading you to become a bargaining rep are out.
Don't do that.
The reason why we talk about this is there's a big tactical question which you need to ask yourself about bargaining reps. And we had a case several years ago where a company came to us and said, look, pretty decent workforce, very engaged. Because of the nature of our work, we're starting to be involved more and more in avenues of work which involve union. The union's getting a bit of a foothold in part of our business, and we're probably going to find ourselves in a bargaining world very, very soon. And the first question we asked them was, well, look, let's accept that as a given. And I think it was true, it was a given. The question then was, well, look, okay, the union are clearly going to be a bargaining rep, but tactically, is it better to dilute the process with lots of employee bargaining reps, or are we better off just concentrating, dealing with the union and concentrating then on the vote? On that occasion, we ended up with 36 bargaining reps. Importantly, you don't have to meet in the room at the same time. That company had a wonderful process of sort of shuttle negotiations all around Australia. And we were able to use that as a tactical way of managing the union's input into the process and giving primacy to the employee input. So I don't want that to sound like an anti-union proposition, but on that occasion, that was the appropriate place to start. So there is that question of sometimes it's better to have more, sometimes it's better to have few.
And we've got a really excellent question from a listener. What happens if an employee group does not have a union and no employees nominate themselves as a bargaining representative?
That's a profoundly good question, and I'm pleased you've asked it. Believe it or not, one, I would probably encourage to see if the employees are prepared to do it. But at the end of the day, you would initiate bargaining. That's your obligation. You send out the bargaining rights notice. If nobody comes forward, so be it. I'm assuming you've made reasonable inquiries to make sure there's no default union. You've got 21 days in which to decide what you want. Nobody's still coming forward. After 21 days having issued the notice, you can go to a vote.
That's right.
It sounds bizarre because you sort of end up bargaining with yourself. So understand you've got the cultural question of explaining what you want in the agreement to the employees, making sure that they're going to vote positively for it. But at the end of the day, if nobody comes forward, that doesn't prevent you from proceeding. You'll just be lonely at the table when you have your bargaining sessions, but you can do that.
And of course, you've got to take all reasonable steps to explain the document to the people during the access period. Those are all the nuts and bolts of compliance of the Fair Work Act. You have to make sure that all employees get
access to a copy of the agreement.
Indeed, indeed. So it doesn't, obviously, as Nigel said, preclude you from doing it. It just changes slightly how you do it. But you must, of course, as we said, there is one objective in this, and that is to get a yes vote.
Get a yes vote. Yeah, look, that's a good one. I haven't come across that yet, but I suspect that it could probably happen. It could happen. Look, the other thing we just wanted to touch on was good faith bargaining. I'm not sure if this is a personal frustration. Mike might share it as much as me. Please, 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 please do not be scared by the phrase good faith bargaining. Don't be worried if you're dealing with a union in particular. In a union, every meeting says you're not bargaining in good faith. I'm about to go into a negotiation in the education sector where I'm probably going to be told that on a regular basis. It won't fluster me, I can assure you. Good faith bargaining rules are the sort of Marquis of Queensberry rules. They're really not that arduous. You must recognise all bargaining reps. You've got to attend and participate in negotiations at reasonable times. You've got to disclose information relevant to what you're putting. It doesn't have to be confidential information. You've got to respond. You've got to give genuine consideration. So you can be quite boisterous in your approach. You can be, you can say no a lot. Do it cleverly, please, but you can say no a lot. It's not about making an agreement. It's not about making concessions. It's really just about conducting yourself in an orderly and reasonable way as a matter of process. And probably the last one, you see that little dot point down there about no capricious or unfair conduct. That's probably the one you might just think a little bit about. You can fall foul of that sometimes if you start writing to your employees saying the employee bargaining reps or the union bargaining reps are saying this, and you get it wrong. And that can fall foul a little bit of the unfair conduct stuff. But all in all, pretty easy to follow.
You can argue very, very, very vigorously, but you don't need to, as you say, agree to proposals necessarily. You're not required to give concessions to the union.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into the big tactical question, which I always try and work out. Do the bargaining representatives need to make an agreement in principle? And Mike made the comment the other day, about 10 minutes ago. You might have a bargaining rep who carries a lot of votes. And it might well be that the people who are actually in the room negotiating with you at the end of the day are going to carry the vote. Well, it's probably folly not leaving the table with at least an agreement in principle. Sometimes, though, the truth is that you probably don't reach an agreement around the table. You agree to disagree, and you say, well, that's okay, but we're now going to put this agreement to the vote. That raises lots of questions, which we always get. When can I go to a vote? How do I do that? The bottom line is this. Once you've got past the statutory 21 days when from start, you can't have a vote. As long as you have followed your good faith bargaining obligations, as long as there's nothing material left on the table unanswered, if you want to take an agreement to the vote, you can take it. The bargaining reps don't have to cut a deal that then gets voted on, right?
But of course, there's the 7-day access period. You must take all steps to provide a copy, make that available, explain it. All of those rudimentary things.
So you've got to get the nuts and bolts right about how do I actually take it to a vote. That's right. That's why you're going to ring Michael to make sure you've got those boxes ticked. But the bottom line is this: is that you don't have to make a deal with the bargaining reps. You can do it yourself and go to the vote. My favourite method of voting depends on what you want to achieve. Most votes these days are electronic, which means that they're privately run, not by the Australian Electoral Commission. People vote independently of anybody else being around. I tend to prefer that, but we could have a probably too long a conversation about voting. But just understand, you don't need a deal at the table to go to the vote.
And you can put your hands up in a meeting with all employees. That can be validly approving of an agreement. You can do it via SurveyMonkey. There's a Fair Work Commission case on that particular point.
You'll have to tell me about that one later. Look, I just want to negotiation basics. I'll spend 5 minutes and then we might wrap up. Bargaining's a bit like a chess game. I'm an appalling chess player. I apologise. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. And some golden rules. The beginning's about tone. It's about, are you going to bargain relationally? What are you going to do? Golden rule about document control. Never give up document control. Never draft in committee. Please, please, please. And if it is a long process, and some negotiations can take 6, 7, 12 months. More often than not, it's about, are you holding the high ground?
Right.
Are you withstanding the pressure? And the point you made earlier, are you coping with the fatigue, and are your employees coping with the fatigue? And are you looking for that opportunity to close? And think along the way, the basics. Who's going to negotiate? And I'll probably touch on 2 or 3 of these. Most of these are fairly straightforward. There's a golden rule in bargaining about who's going to negotiate. I call it the rule of 3. I never like to take more than 3 people in the negotiating team. 1 to talk, 1 to write, and 1 to listen. There's no point taking 3 talkers in because they normally miss all of the nuance of the body language in the room.
And you don't need a cadre of employer representatives. You don't need to beat your chest with 25 people. It's just completely
if they've got
unnecessary.
10, you don't need 10 either. So I've often gone in with just 2. And understand everybody's got to know their role, and you've got to make sure that they're credible, they've got the right style. I'm a big antagonist about putting the CEO in the room. Never want to put the decision maker on the spot. Would prefer never to do that. Probably the last one I'm going to touch on before we wrap up is preparing for each meeting. Probably the last one I'm going to touch on before we wrap up is preparing for each meeting and debriefing. There's nothing more frustrating than somebody saying, "Oh, we've got a meeting, we've got a bargaining meeting in half an hour. I'll see you in there." Look, that's folly. You should be working very closely on what your objectives are in the meeting. And once you finish the meeting, set yourself 40 minutes aside to debrief. What did I see? What did I hear? And then, what's the communication we're going to write? So think closely about who's going to negotiate. Think closely about making sure you put enough time aside to prepare and to debrief. And then probably just lastly, are there any corporate rules? There's nothing worse than finding yourself a long way down the track and somebody in head office turns around and says, "Oh, by the way, we're not comfortable with you doing that or agreeing to that." So that can really create some disenchantment with the process. But those are pretty much the basics. Now I'm going to look at Lillian. I think we're perfectly on time, Michael. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I think that's been very helpful for everyone who's listened in. So thank you.
Take care, mate. And to the listeners, thank you for staying, and we'll hand over to Lillian.
Thank you both. I'm sure our listeners gained some valuable insights on enterprise agreements and collective bargaining. If this webinar has raised some concerns for you, I've included Nigel and Michael's contact details in this slide, so feel free to contact them directly. As a bonus offer, we'll be sending one of our key bargaining guides to those who participated today. I'll be sending that along with the recording of this webinar to you in the coming days. We have organised a feedback form, so if you can please spare a minute after we sign off to let us know what you thought of it, and if there are any topics you'd be interested in, your feedback would be greatly appreciated. Thank you and have a great afternoon.